everybody. Thanks so much for being here tonight. Thank you, Jakob. Thank you to the Penn Festival of Voices. And we really have just an amazing lineup tonight. And really, with no further ado, I want to start off with Lester Brown, who I am just so honored to be sharing the stage with tonight. He's been on top of the food story, not for the past 10 years or 20 years, but for the past 50 years, and telling it through more than 50 books, and founder of the Earth Institute and World Watch. And I was just talking to him before we came on tonight, and he was telling me about his new project, which really has to do with how food security and energy security are now becoming one and the same sort of security. So he's actually fascinating. How the evening is going to work is Lester will come up, talk for a little bit, and then Robert and Marion will come and will respond. So let's start with Lester, and I hope you'll give him a warm welcome.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. The thesis of my comments is that the world food situation is tightening. And we began to see signs of this. Probably the first time it really surfaced in a meaningful way was in 2007. Food prices had gone up, and two exporting countries, Russia and Argentina, both leading wheat exporters, became so concerned about their domestic food prices that they restricted or even for a time banned wheat exports. And that triggered a panic in the importing countries because they suddenly realized they couldn't rely on the market if the exporting countries intervened and began to restrict exports. So that was a real sort of wake-up call. And it was, if I were to pick an event and introduce what I call the new geopolitics of food, that would have been it. Over the last decade, food prices have doubled, and they're probably going to continue to rise. And while we've seen hunger and malnutrition for a long time, we're now beginning to see a new sort of manifestation of this, one that's new to me at least. I've just come across this in the last few years. And this is a situation where families, many of them living in cities, can simply no longer afford to eat every day. So on Sunday night, they get together and say, well, this week we won't eat on Wednesday and Saturday. They won't eat because they can't afford to eat every day. And this is a new, we've seen, one meal a day when things got tight and the hunger and malnutrition associated with that. We have not before seen the planning of foodless days. Why have things tightened? Well, on the demand side, we're looking at the fastest growth in world grain demand in history. We're adding 80 million people a year. That's not new. We've been adding that many or close to that many now for some decades. So the population growth is almost a given. But in addition, we now have rising affluence emerging as a major new source of demand for food. People, probably 3 billion or so, moving up the food chain. And what that leads to, and I'll use India and the US to illustrate, is that in a country like India, annual grain consumption is about 400 pounds per person per year. A pound a day. When you only have a pound of grain per day, you have to eat almost all of it directly just to keep body and soul together. You can't afford to convert much into animal protein. In the United States, I'm going to use round numbers for illustrative purposes, we consume about 1,600 pounds of grain per year, or 4 times as much as the 400 pounds per year in India. And that enables us to live pretty high on the food chain. It means we convert a lot of grain into meat, milk, and eggs. And it takes a lot of grain. A pound of beef in the feedlot, a pound of additional live weight takes about 7 pounds of grain. A pound of pork takes 3 or 4 pounds of grain. Poultry is down under 2 pounds now, which is why poultry is the cheapest meat in the market. So we have people moving up the food chain on a scale we've not seen before. And nowhere is this more dramatic than in China, because of the size of its population, 1.3 billion people, and the rate of economic growth that not only enables people to move up the food chain, but to move up very fast. And one of the consequences of that is that meat consumption in China, which 20 years ago was well below that in the United States, this is total meat consumption, is now double that in the United States. The Chinese people, China as a country is consuming twice as much meat as the United States, and they're going to keep moving. I mean, they want to eventually have diets like we have. I mean, this is sort of what we're seeing throughout the world. Everyone wants to move up the food chain. It was after World War II, right around 1950, when we realized that we could no longer get enough beef or mutton from grazing alone. And we had to start feeding. So we developed the feedlot system where steers are on grass for the first 8-10 months of their lives, and then they're put in feedlots and fed grain so they grow faster and become much fatter. So the feeding of grain to beef animals is a relatively new thing. Historically, it was mostly grain and hay. So that's greatly increased the intensity of agriculture. On the supply side, in response to this record growth in demand, and incidentally, just to put some numbers on that, a decade or so ago, the annual growth in world grain consumption was about 20 million tons per year. In recent years, it's been close to 40 million tons a year, or roughly twice as much. So it's a very vigorous sort of expansion in demand now in response to rising incomes. Even as demand is growing at a record rate, it's becoming difficult for farmers to keep up with this growth in demand. We have 4 constraints emerging that's making it difficult for farmers to go as fast as they would like and as fast as the market would like. One is there's not a lot of new land out there to plow. The world grain area last year was roughly the same as it was in 1950. No measurable difference. What was different, and this is another story in and of itself, is the enormous growth in the demand for soybeans. Just a short paragraph on soybeans. We don't eat many soybeans directly, but almost everything you see when you open your refrigerator, whether it's milk or cheese or hamburger or what have you, has a soybean component. Because everyone knows today that if you're feeding beef animals or pigs or chickens, if you mix 4 parts grain and 1 part soybean meal, get some high quality protein in there, animals can convert grain into protein much more efficiently. So the soybean has become part of the package. Everywhere you go today, and you're looking at feeding pigs or cattle or chicken, they're getting some soybean meal. And that's a challenge because we're not very good at raising soybean meals. We get more soybeans primarily by planting more soybeans. One consequence of that is that in the Western Hemisphere today, there's more land in soybeans than either wheat or corn. So we have land, and we've been very good at raising grain yields. We've tripled world grain yields up until now, but it's becoming more difficult, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The other thing it takes, in addition to land, to grow food is water. And water is emerging as the principal, most imminent constraint on efforts to expand food production. Climate change is an issue, but it's sort of unfolding over time. Water is beginning to hit and already reduce harvests in a number of countries. Just as an example, the Arab countries in the Middle East as a group have all overpumped their aquifers and wells have been going dry. The Saudis, for example, who were self-sufficient in wheat for 30 years or so, eventually pumped their essentially fossil aquifers, that is aquifers that do not recharge, dry. So they're now turning to the outside world. And by 2016, we'll be getting all of their grain from other countries. They won't be producing any. These are their own projections. So water has emerged as a major issue and kind of constraint on efforts to expand food production. Another is the sort of limits of technology. Once you eliminate moisture constraints on grain yields and nutrient constraints, you put on whatever fertilizer the plant needs and can use, then the next constraint is the process of photosynthesis itself. And in the more agriculturally advanced countries now, farmers are beginning to bump against the limits of photosynthesis. So this is not something we know how to bypass or to, short of restructuring and making photosynthesis more efficient, which we've not figured out how to do. We're in some trouble. When we look at raising grain yields around the world, the first country that hit the photosynthetic ceiling was Japan, and that was 17 years ago. Grain yields in Japan also were the first to start rising among any country. Back in the 1880s, they started rising, but 17 years ago, they stopped and they plateaued. Now, the significance of that goes far beyond Japan, because China, which started raising yields much more recently, is now within about 4% of Japan in rice yield. So it's probably not going to, I don't think Chinese farmers can do any better than Japanese farmers. So I think China's rice production is about to plateau. With wheat, the plateauing is coming in most obviously in Western Europe, where in France, wheat yields have increased for the last 15 years now, in the UK, in Germany, in all three of these countries, and many other countries in Europe. I cite those because I looked pretty carefully at the data. So we're running into the photosynthetic limits in the more agriculturally advanced countries. Corn is, we've done better in raising corn yields than we have with wheat or rice. I mean, corn is for those of you who know some biology, is a C4 plant, which means its photosynthesis is a bit more efficient than that of wheat or rice. But we get up close to 10 tons per hectare, which is where we are in Iowa now, and we don't really know how to go beyond that. I would just point out, to give a sense of how productive U.S. agriculture has become, I would point out that Iowa now produces more grain than Canada. And at the same time, more soybeans than China. This is prime real estate. If you're looking for some land investments, look at Iowa. Extraordinarily productive land. Now, in addition to land and water constraints and technological constraints, we have a new variable now, which is climate change. Agriculture, as it exists today, has evolved over an 11,000-year period of rather remarkable climate stability. And now suddenly, climate is changing. The agricultural system was designed to maximize production with the climate system that we had over this 11,000-year period. I mean, there were a few blips here and there, but basically climate's been pretty stable ever since agriculture began. But now, climate is changing, so with each passing year, the climate system and the agricultural system are more and more out of sync with each other. And what this will translate into, we really just don't know. We're not knowledgeable enough to project this into the future. So we've got land constraints, water constraints, technological constraints, and climate change. What do we do? I think we're going to have to look at the population issue. We're now projected to add 2 billion more people by when, 2050 or so. It's not going to be easy to adequately feed 2 billion more people when 1 billion people are currently not being fed adequately. And then we have to think about, and the population is not just a simple matter of making sure that women everywhere have access to reproductive health care and family planning services, though that's important. It also means eradicating poverty. And those two reinforce each other. Once you get them going, then countries can move pretty fast. Families, the shift to smaller families accelerates, and they can begin to raise living standards much more rapidly. That's a positive feedback loop. In looking at water, I'd like to quickly look at the big three grain producers, because each faces a very different situation. The big three being China, India, and the United States. These three countries produce half of the world's grain crop. China relies heavily on irrigation. For about 80% of its grain land is irrigated. But of that 80%, most of it is surface water, but not all of it. The Chinese are now pumping the deep aquifer under the North China Plain, which happens to be a fossil aquifer, which means it does not recharge. It's like oil. Once it's gone, it's gone. We have a fossil aquifer in this country. It's the Ogallala aquifer in the western Kansas, Oklahoma, northern and western Texas, that area. And it's being depleted. The wells are going dry. An irrigated area has shrunk substantially in Texas. I don't know, 20, 30%. It's shrinking in Oklahoma and Kansas. But it's not a big problem for us because most of our grain is produced in the Corn Belt. I mentioned Iowa's extraordinary productivity, but it's Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, that whole area that is just so productive. So China is running into some problems on the waterfront. The U.S. not being much affected by aquifer depletion because it plays such a small role. As I mentioned, most of our grain is produced in the Corn Belt, but the country that's suffering is India. In India, you do not need a license to drill an irrigation well. As a result, with good grain prices in recent years, 26 million farmers in India have drilled irrigation wells. And not too surprisingly, the water table today is falling in every state in India. So this is, I mean, you can overpump in the short run, but not in the long run. And when the aquifer goes dry, the rate of pumping is reduced to the rate of recharge. So we're looking at some downturns there. I mentioned the Arab countries in the Middle East. That's exactly what they did. The grain production was going up, and then they overpumped. The wells started going dry, and their grain production went down. Today they're importing most of their grain, and we're seeing this happening in other countries that are not quite so far along. Another thing we can do besides get the brakes on population growth and raise water productivity is, on the demand side, we can move down the food chain because we're living higher than we should for our own health, and by reducing the animal protein and animal fat in our diet, we'll be healthier and the planet will be healthier. So that's kind of a cushion. The other cushion, incidentally, is the fact that of our 400 million ton per year grain harvest, about 130 million tons goes to produce ethanol fuel. That, I think, is not the way we want to go. And we're beginning to back away from that a little bit, and I hope we continue to do so. Bottom line, people are being squeezed around the world in terms of being able to afford enough food. And we're seeing the emergence of foodless days which we've not seen before. This is a stress indicator beyond just being undernourished, one meal a day, not getting enough food, but actually having food that stays, I think, has some potential consequences for nutrition and health, particularly for youngsters in the society. So those are the issues that I think we're facing. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you. Rather a frightening introduction to the evening as we hit 2 billion more people, having double food production in 30 years, and not being able to increase the area in which we can cultivate. Sounds like a problem to me. So, in order to solve the problem, let me introduce first Marion Nestle, who's a professor, yeah, come on up, at NYU Food Studies, and really one of the, she really needs no introduction. She's one of my great inspirations in food. Has done everything, been everywhere, and her book Food Politics is a Bible to many people. And also, professor from Wellesley of political science, Robert Paarlberg, is here also. Hope you'll give him a warm welcome also. And what the best thing about Robert really is that he wrote a book also called Food Politics, so I only have to remember the name of one book. So, you know, let me start, Robert, with you. Lester talks a lot about price and how this is going to be a driver in terms of global hunger. What do you think is going to drive down price? I mean, you have been on record with very strong opinions about local food, about organic food, about genetically modified food. What do you think is going to be a driver which is going to bring down the price? What do you think are going to be the main constituents there? And I'm going to sit down here next to you and continue much more informally.
Well, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. I don't think I'm as concerned with prices on the world market as Lester is. I'm more concerned with prices on domestic markets. And when the world price shot up in 2008, it was in part because, as Lester said, export restraints were set in place to stabilize prices on the domestic market. So while rice prices tripled on the world market, rice prices domestically in many countries scarcely rose at all, and only 6% of the world's rice is traded. So the price on the world market was an exaggeration of the hardships that people felt. But let me say that I share Lester's sense of alarm, but I think we're alarmed about different things. Lester, listening to you, seems to be worried about the growth of hunger in the future because of resource constraints and resource exhaustion. And I'm more concerned about the hunger that exists today for reasons that really have nothing to do with resource constraints or resource exhaustion. I do a lot of work in Africa, going to Africa this month and again in June. If you head into the country in Africa, you will see communities where 1 out of 3 is chronically undernourished, 250 million Africans altogether. And the reasons really have nothing to do with falling water tables. They don't irrigate. Nothing to do with land constraints. Africa is the most sparsely populated continent of the 3, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. They're not polluting the water. They don't use any agricultural chemicals. They're poor and hungry because they lack the things that farmers in the rest of the world have used to escape poverty.
So you're saying Western methods, Robert, if we just give them the right seeds and the right fertilizers, then they're going to eradicate their problem?
Oh, much more than that. First, they don't have rural clinics. They don't have rural schools. Most farmers in Africa are women who are illiterate. They can't read or write in any language. They don't have a road system. 70% of Africans live more than 2 kilometers from the nearest paved road, so they can't get fertilizer and seeds in, and they can't get their product out if they were to produce a surplus. They don't have any electrical power. They don't have any machinery. They don't have any veterinary medicine for their animals. Only 4% of land is irrigated. So when the rains fail, their crop fails. These things really aren't resource deficits. They're not running into yield limits. You can get 4 or 5 tons per hectare of maize in Africa, but in Tanzania they're only getting 1 ton per hectare because they don't use hybrid seeds and they don't use fertilizer. So here is a continent where we have enormous destitution and chronic undernutrition today because investments aren't being made, because we're not upgrading agriculture. It's not because we've hit some limit, it's not because the resource base has been degraded.
So Marion, what is your take on the causes of global malnutrition and if you like in particular malnutrition in Africa? Do you share Robert's perspective here responding to it?
Well, I actually had a different take on what Lester said. I was, while he was talking, I was sort of making notes on what we needed to do. And what we needed to do was to solve a variety of social problems. And I was thinking that we know that to solve problems of malnutrition at the household level, what you do is you promote breastfeeding, you educate women. So that's one where we're talking about the same thing. You promote breastfeeding, education of women, you try to arrange, you have to have a stable political system. You have to do something about population control and
so these are non-food solutions. Robert seems to be saying that the solutions are more specific to creating greater harvests, and you're actually talking almost meta-food solutions.
Well, I think that's what you have to do, because what Robert said was that there's food available, it just can't be produced or it can't be distributed. And if you want food distributed in these places, you have to deal with all of these other problems. You have to deal with things like population control, which nobody is allowed to talk about ever because of the religious implications. You have to talk about capitalism, which nobody is ever allowed to talk about because you're communist if you do. And these are enormous social problems of which food is a manifestation, not necessarily a cause.
Lester, nobody's following, nobody's taking your bait on resources here. I'm scared we're running out of water and land, but they don't. They don't see it. What do you have your microphone? I want to hear your response.
He's speechless.
The Arab countries in the Middle East are concerned that, if they had their
They don't have any water.
And the dependence on the outside world bothers them because it creates opportunities for all sorts of political leverage on them, for example. And particularly when such a large share of the exports come from one country, this leaves them feeling a bit uneasy. And some of these problems are relatively new. We're just beginning to see the consequences, like aquifer depletion. We didn't really get serious about pumping underground water until probably somewhere around 1970. Up until then, we built dams. But we ran out of places to build dams, so then to expand irrigation, we had to start looking for underground water. But aquifer depletion is widespread today.
It seems to me when I talk to a lot of people about food, actually, Marion, did you want to say something right there?
I was going to say, I was in the Emirates, and they're desalinating like mad, but they have more money than anybody. So they didn't afford to do it. It's hugely expensive.
I mean, it takes 1,000 tons of water to produce 1 ton of grain. Desalting it is not something that...
And how much energy does it take for desalination? It seems to be the energy question, the food question, you can't
Well, they have
separate.
two kinds of water. They have drinking water and water that they use for watering.
But it seems to me what I was going to say is that what I hear a lot is a technological solution. There's got to be some sort of technological solution to global hunger, like a killer app. Almost, if we could just right, killer app for hunger. And this brings me back to what Robert was saying earlier, because it seems to me there's a lot of technology going into seeds and hybrid seeds. Can you talk a little bit more about your sense of how seeds are going to save the day?
Well, I mentioned the situation of Tanzania right now. Maize is the staple food in Tanzania. And it's possible if you switch from openly pollinated varieties to hybrid varieties, and if you then use fertilizer. Hybrid varieties are not GMOs, by the way. If you make this switch, you can increase your yields from the Tanzanian average today, 1 ton per hectare, up to 2, 3, or 4 tons per hectare. They're not doing that because the government of Tanzania devotes only about 5 to 8% of its public budget to any kind of agricultural development, even though 70% of the people in Tanzania are farmers or herdsmen in the countryside. So they haven't made the upgrade. So the only way for Tanzania to increase its maize production has been to expand the area planted to maize. That means moving into drier areas where the yield is even lower and where they run into pastoralist communities. It's a source of tension and difficulty. So if you don't use a technology already on the shelf, you're going to create resource constraint that's completely unnecessary.
I think we should also point out, I mean, just when you talk about moving into new land, which is that agriculture is the #1 environmental hit on the earth every year. More greenhouse gases are produced, more water is used. And so I guess what you're saying is that by the use of the hybrid seed and the technology, that we're going to be able to increase yield without increasing land area. What do you make of this, Marion? Do you think hybrid seeds are going to be the killer app here?
I don't know. I mean, I've always been impressed that working on third world agricultural problems is really, really challenging. You can't underestimate the difficulty of trying to engineer or even genetically cross things that are going to work really well under these harsh conditions and resource poor conditions. But I keep coming back to the social problems. If Tanzania had a government that was really interested in these kinds of things, maybe there would be progress made in a way that can't be made now when they're not putting any resources into it. And so it invariably comes back to politics. And I'm thinking about
the United States Department of State, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. Well, that's politics. So, I mean, the UNICEF has this wonderful framework that they did in 1990 of the causes of malnutrition. And food is just this tiny little part up at the top. The rest of it has to do with whether there's health care, whether there's education, whether there are ideological problems that interfere with people being able to have some kind of income equity and other kinds of things.
Intestinal parasites.
Intestinal parasites are incredibly important. And then the political structure and economic structure.
Food is such a complex problem. When I started writing about food about 15 years ago, I thought I could write about food, but instead you end up writing about everything.
Well, that's why we have whole programs on it.
So let's move from the third world back to the homeland. Robert, what do you think are some of the things we can do here, and maybe even some people in the audience here, we might be able to do to try to make a difference and impact this problem? In other words, a lot of
the problem that I refer to of people who are chronically undernourished.
Well, what I'm saying is a lot of people, I think, believe that by their food choices, by buying organic food, by going to Whole Foods, by buying local food, by using artisanal ingredients, by cooking at home, by going to their local green market, they're helping to solve this problem. What do you think? Does the United States even matter? Or is this really a problem of India and China, and we are just beside the point at this point?
What the United States can do, and has done historically, is provide public sector development assistance to governments in Africa that are very low on resources and can use some financial support in building the roads, putting in electricity, putting in the irrigation, doing the agricultural research, building the health clinics, building the schools. External support for that is useful. And I fault the United States government for underinvesting in agricultural development assistance. Between 1980 and 2006, the United States government, not the State Department, but USAID, cut its assistance to African agriculture by 86%. We decided, we don't have to do this anymore. At a time when the number of Africans experiencing chronic undernutrition was doubling. So I would like to revive those programs. I think that's what Americans can do. We sometimes think through our personal choices we can make a difference, but there the links are very weak. A study was done at the International Food Policy Research Institute several years ago. It asked hypothetically, what if Americans reduced their per capita meat consumption by 50%? Would this free up resources for the production of food that would lower prices on the world market enough to save people in Africa from going hungry? And they have a sophisticated economic model. They demonstrated that the results would be trivial. If you reduce meat consumption in the United States, the market responds by reducing meat production in the United States. So a lot of pasture land
But isn't that
reverts to
save
grassland.
water? It'll save water.
It'll save water in the United States, but it won't make more water available in the Emirates or in India. It will make people healthier in the United States, but it won't make people healthier in Africa. It will free up corn and soybeans, but Africans don't import yellow maize and soybeans. They have a completely different food system. So what we do here isn't going to provide as much health through the marketplace as what our government can do to provide assistance through public sector support.
Marion, what's your take? What can we do here?
Well, I think there are plenty of things that people can do in the United States, and that a lot of the things that you mentioned raise consciousness about food issues in a way that we've never had before. We have a food movement in the United States with huge numbers of people who are interested in these kinds of things. I measure it by the number of food studies programs. That's my personal metric, because we started food studies here at NYU in 1996. We were kind of first, but we were pretty close to being first, and the Boston University had one before us. But now there are food studies programs everywhere with hordes of students studying it, and some of those are going to be looking at international programs and looking at big picture problems and trying to deal with big picture problems in a way that I think is really terrific. So I'm not opposed at all to making personal choices that are going to create a healthier food system, and even if it's local and even if it's us. We set an example for the world. Everybody wants to eat like us. Everybody wants American food products, which we haven't talked about yet. Food products that are promoting obesity everywhere. And one of the things that we could do to release food for the world is not to be so obese. If we look at it that way.
Well, there's the issue
and
of
there's obesity everywhere. As the economies are going up, you have this dual or triple burden of obesity, undernutrition, and malnutrition in the same family.
Well, Raj Patel owns that stuffed and starved argument
Right.
that as people become more and more hungry, also people become more and more obese. And we can see those statistics writ large across the world. And a lot of that, I think, actually has to do with American foodways.
Mm-hmm.
What do you, you've been advocating, Robert, that we teach the world how to farm. Would you also advocate that we teach the world how to eat?
No.
Elaborate, please.
I'm not a big fan of the American diet. But I'm not sure that it's something that any government can or really should try to control. Not sure I'd want to live in a country where the government had the authority to tell people what to eat. So what I see about the American food system is a double-edged sword. We have a system that provides an enormous variety of affordable food products, both healthy and unhealthy. And many Americans, and much more than in the past. In the 1970s, the typical supermarket had only 150 produce items. Now it's got 400 produce items. So if you want to eat healthy in the United States, it's easier than ever before, and it's more affordable than ever before. But if you want to eat unhealthy, it's also easier and more affordable than ever before. And I fault companies for fabricating products that are loaded with salt and sugar and fat and hyperpalatable, almost addictive. You can't put it down once you've had the first bite. I fault them for that. But they're only part of the problem, because in the population, not just in the United States but around the world, we have an inherited interest in sweet foods. We like things that taste good. As urban dwellers, our time is valuable. We like convenience. Many Americans, frankly, when they make food choices, don't put their health first. They put convenience and taste first. And so it's a mix of what food companies do and what consumers do that is generating the bad example that we set as a society as a whole.
Marion and I were just discussing before we got on up here tonight the fact that Walmart has gone so completely into the organic market and is now underselling Whole Foods by about.
Or at least that's what they say.
Well, what do you make of that? What do you make of food choices as a solution here? Do you think the government should intervene?
Oh, absolutely.
I figured you might disagree with me on that.
Because you're dealing with $30 billion a year in food marketing.
30 billion.
Yeah, roughly. That's 10 or 15 that goes through advertising agencies, and then the rest goes in other ways. It's not a hard number. It's a ballpark number, but it's a very big number. And no public health agency has anywhere near the kind of money that Coca-Cola spends just to advertise Classic Coke, which is roughly $250 billion a year. 250 million, sorry, too many zeros in that one. $250 million a year just to advertise Classic Coke. I mean, no public health agency has anywhere near that kind of money for their thing.
Do you think that kind of government intervention could work in the third world? So in other words, the government of Tanzania, maybe they can't get hybrid seeds going, but maybe they can stop supersizing Coca-Colas?
I think that would be an excellent idea. They certainly can do it, and the countries that do it have less obesity than we do. But most countries can't because they are beholden to these large food corporations who put tremendous pressure on them. I mean, I can't wait to see what happens with the World Health Organization.
But let me ask you the tough question here. Let me put you on the spot here then. How are we going to double global food production by 2050? How are we going to do that?
Well, that I don't know the answer to. I think you have to deal with population control and make sure the population...
That we don't get to 9 billion.
That we don't get to 9 billion, and that everybody has to get really serious about that.
All right, then we'll leave it at 7 billion as it is now. How do we feed that bottom billion?
Well, my understanding... No, wait, you're asking two questions.
Now I am, yeah.
Is there enough food to feed 7 billion? Yes. How do you get food to that bottom billion? That's a political question. That's a social and political question. It's not a food production question.
And perhaps financial too.
Well, yeah, since politics is so closely tied to money.
Is it really?
I think so.
Robert, how do we feed that bottom billion?
Well, the 250 million chronically undernourished people living in remote rural Africa aren't going to be fed through redistribution. No one's going to pay to move food to them. The only way to feed them is to increase their income. The only way to increase their income so that they can demand food in between harvests, in particular during the hungry season. The only way to do that is to increase the productivity of their labor. The only way to do that is to give them the tools that they need to be more productive as farmers. That's the only way to do it.
And educate women.
Well, absolutely, the farmers are women. And they don't have schools now. As I said, they're illiterate. It's all the things I talked about earlier. But it's not a global redistribution scheme that we're talking about here. Because the undernutrition problems are in remote locations that are far away from the infrastructure of distribution. And no one's volunteering to pay for the distribution anyway.
Robert, do you believe in the right to food, that everybody on Earth actually has a right to food, no matter what their income?
Who would you put in jail then because someone in Africa doesn't have food?
Oh, I'm not legislating it. It's part of the UN. One of the statements that the UN puts out that people they have a right to an education.
It's a useful philosophical concept if it makes people more inclined to organize and demand less metaphysical rights that can actually be of some use to them, like the right to vote, the right to live in a democratic society, the right to a government that invests in their sector of the economy. If it can lead to that, I'm all for it. But you can't by fiat feed people by somewhere in the United Nations system deciding they have a right to food.
What do you think, Marion? What do you think of the United Nations declaration that there's a global right to food?
I think it sets a standard. There's nobody enforcing it, and the UN is the last agency in the world that's going to be able to enforce something like that. But it sets a moral standard about the kind of society that we want to live in. I want to live in a society in which people have enough food, and in which there's more equity, and in which people are educated, and schools are good even in low-income areas. And we don't have 20% of our population considered to be food insecure, and we don't have 60% of our population considered to be overweight or obese. I'd like to live in a society that's more equitable all the way around.
Speaking of a moral society, Lester brought up what to me in kind of an offhand way was kind of a disturbing piece of advice for you in the audience, which was to invest in Iowa farmland.
$20,000 an acre, I'm told.
And it's going up. And in fact, what I hear is that there are a lot of people who have been investing in farmland.
Chinese.
All over the world.
Here too.
Exactly, and this kind of leads to I think a larger question, because when there is scarcity and when there is price increase and when food becomes clearly a more valuable item, we get to my pet topic, which is the interest of Wall Street and the very large moneyed interests on the earth in global food. What do you think, Marion? What can we do what should we do about the fact that there's increased interest on Wall Street in global food and investing in it and perhaps even driving up the price of it?
Oh yeah, I just got a thing in the mail from some industry consulting group which says there's a bull market in food.
That's right.
And everybody ought to be investing in it because there's going to be high profits. And certainly if prices are going up, the profits will be even higher, won't they? I don't know. I've always felt that food was something. This is your thing, Fred. Fruit is something that you shouldn't speculate with because lives are at stake. And you don't want to speculate with these kinds of things. I feel the same way about an awful lot of pharmaceutical drugs as well, that when lives are at stake, pharmaceutical companies shouldn't be allowed to set prices that are so high that people can't afford to buy them. And the same thing is true of food. But I'm sort of, as you could tell, in favor of a slightly different society than the one that we have.
It's the communism, Marion. I don't know what we're going to do with you.
Guilty.
Robert, do you think that we should just let the market handle the price of food, and we should just once again stay away? Or what do you think is going to happen to the price of food moving forward?
Well, in the United States, we don't rely just on the market. We have we spend $112 billion every year on federal nutrition programs, including the SNAP program, the WIC program, federal school lunch program. We supplement the market for low income and for needy categories of citizens, and I think those are wonderful programs.
Yet the price of food continues to rise.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. We had a $13.9 billion bushel corn harvest last year, and the price of corn has dropped considerably. And some of those people who bought land at the peak are going to lose money now. I don't think. I remember. I'm old enough to remember a previous food price spike back in the 1970s. And
when your father was in the Nixon administration.
When my father was in the Nixon administration. And even then, Arab countries were making large investments in African land. The Gulf countries made huge investments in Sudan. They were going to make Sudan the breadbasket of the Arab world. Then monetary policies at the Fed changed, commodity prices collapsed, and all those investments dried up and went bust. And a lot of people in the United States, in United States agriculture, who've been persuaded that the world was running out of food and the price was going to go up forever, had borrowed heavily in order to expand their farming operations. When interest rates went up, when the money supply was tightened, they lost the farm. There was a financial crisis in the 1980s that was a searing experience for some of the best and most aggressive farmers of the day, because prices fell and interest rates went up. Something that they hadn't been warned might happen, it happened, and it could happen again. As I say, prices are already coming down.
Marion, your sense of volatility in land investment and food price?
Yeah, I just want to I want to, first of all, put my Republican credentials on the line. I worked for the government in the Reagan administration.
You're a good guy.
I just want everybody to know that. The business with prices is interesting. I'm interested in agricultural policy being shifted so that it supports health policy. I'd like to see them tied together. And although prices are sort of stable for a lot of things, or going down for corn and soybeans or whatever, I really haven't been tracking that. What I have been tracking is the price of fruits and vegetables, and those are clearly going up. And the Department of Commerce has this nice data that I like that shows that the increase in index price of fruits and vegetables has gone up by about 40% since 1980, whereas the price of, what do they say, bread, not bread, but butter, soda, and beer has gone down by 15 to 30%. I love showing that figure. So there's something skewed about that, and there's something skewed about the idea that you can go to McDonald's with $5 and buy 5 hamburgers or 1 salad. So there's something funny going on with that. I'd like to see some kind of shift that promotes consumption of healthier foods.
What kind of a shift would that be?
Well, we subsidize corn and soybeans, and I know the economists who do these models say that removing the subsidies wouldn't have any effect on prices. I find that really hard to believe. But, you know, we could subsidize, we could support fruit and vegetable farmers. We could just make the whole thing a lot easier.
Whenever we have these panels, and I've been on a number of them, there's always the elephant in the room, which is the whole increasingly polemical debate about the genetically modified organisms and the how agriculture is increasingly dependent upon genetically modified corn and soy, and these are patented intellectual properties of large corporations. Robert, what is your take? Is this just a big MacGuffin? Should we not be worried about this, or is this something that is legitimate, a legitimate threat to global food? Or quite the opposite, is it the savior of global food?
It's a huge topic. I guess I would start by just mentioning that while corn and soybeans are widely planted in genetically modified form, the big biotech companies have not been able to get either social acceptance or regulatory acceptance for their GMO food crops as such. We've had GMO wheat available since 1994. It's not being grown commercially anywhere. We've had GMO rice available since the 1990s, not being grown commercially anywhere. We had GMO potatoes that were actually in the field back in 1999. Then they were withdrawn when activist groups persuaded fast food restaurants.
Yeah, but we still have, it still is the most widely and most quickly accepted technology in food since forever. I mean, the way it's taken over corn and soy. So
93% of corn.
Marion?
93% of corn I just sold.
And I think corn is a big crop in the United States last time.
Well, corn and soybeans are primarily for animal feed, and a lot of corn goes to ethanol, so it's for industrial purposes. So the consumer resistance is much lower with those crops, and so they've been able to go forward. But the point I'm trying to make is that big muscle companies aren't shoving this stuff down our throat. They've invested hundreds of millions of dollars in technologies from which they haven't made a penny because they've lost the battle of public opinion to activist campaigns against GMOs around the world that have frightened people away from the technology.
But you haven't answered my question. My question is this a positive technology? Is this going to be a way for... Lester's giving us a problem here, which is that we have a certain amount of land, and we have a certain number of people, and we have a certain kind of yield. Are GMOs going to help us feed 9 billion?
Well, one reason the technology is taken up when it's for industrial or for animal feed purposes and there's less social resistance is that it works extremely well. If you're growing BT crops, you can protect...
BT,
it's a transgenic form of a crop that incorporates a naturally occurring bacterium that insects can't digest in their gut. Our gut is much more acidic, so we have no trouble with it. BT is used by organic farmers. They sprinkle it on the crop instead of transgening it into the crop. When farmers plant these crops, they can protect against insects without as many insecticide sprays, sometimes without any insecticide sprays. So they save money, they reduce damage to non-target species in the field, they reduce their own occupational exposure to toxic chemicals. Wherever farmers have been given permission to plant these crops, they've taken off. But because of the stigma against BT crops, there's only one country in sub-Saharan Africa that's given its farmers permission to plant any BT crops, and that's Burkina Faso, and that's only for cotton. No BT maize has been grown anywhere in Africa because it's illegal. And I'm not sure if that's a correct way to deny a productive technology to African farmers who need help.
I know Lester wants to say something, but first let me just ask Marion what you make of the idea that maybe we have a distaste for the idea of a transgenic crop, but if we were hungry and our children were hungry, that distaste would go right down the drain. Do you think going forward we will no longer have that kind of societal onus against the GMO, or do you think this is a legitimate threat that's not going to go away no matter how many hungry people there are?
Well, I think they have to label them. And I don't say that trivially, because I think they should have labeled them right from the beginning, and a lot of the problems that they're having with consumer non-acceptance wouldn't have been there. But they have a real problem now because they fought so hard about labeling. And I was on the FDA Food Advisory Committee in 1994 when all that was going on, and I saw how the biotechnology companies handled that not well, in my view. And they're now paying for decisions that they insisted on 20 years ago. What I worry about with genetically modified foods more than anything else is the lack of sustainability. You have to be able to buy the seeds. You have to be able to...
And the seeds are expensive.
Oh, yeah. They're not Monsanto is not a social service agency. Yeah, and they own patents. You have to buy the seeds. You have to buy the seeds every year.
You have to buy hybrid seeds every year too, Mary.
Right. Certainly with the Roundup, the crops that are Roundup resistant, I mean, there's a considerable amount of evidence it's not very good for the soil in the long run. So at some point, you've got to replenish what's being taken out of the soil, and in the long haul, if we're going to have productive land, it's going to have to be sustainable.
Lester, do you want to comment?
I just wanted to note that with genetic modification, we've been able to develop herbicide-tolerant varieties or insect-resistant varieties. But what we have not been able to do is to increase yields. And the reason we have not been able to use genetic modification to increase yields is because we've already done everything we can think of to do to raise yields using the conventional plant breeding of decades past. We really have, I think, exhausted that potential with the most advanced crops that are pushing against the sort of glass ceiling that's imposed by the process of photosynthesis. So whatever we think the pros and cons are of GMOs, they have not been able to raise yields beyond anything that we were able to do with conventional plant breeding.
So then how are we going to, and this is really to all the respondents here, what is the way that we're going to increase yield then? I mean, I guess Robert's the only one who's given me a programmatic approach here, which is the seeds, the fertilizer, the irrigation. I mean, is that it? I mean, if yield is the issue, is it Lester?
I would add one other thing to the points that Rob made, and that is that given the nature of agricultural markets and the effect of weather on crops and the volatility, I think there's a case to be made for having a minimum support price for grains, especially the staple crops, so that farmers will know when they invest in fertilizer or higher yielding seeds or whatever it is, or irrigation, that they will get a price that will enable them to cover their costs. What we discovered in India way back in the 60s was that once we introduced a support price for wheat, this was after the monsoon failure of 1965, once we introduced a support price for wheat, whether it ever took effect or not, because the prices are often above it, but the fact that it was there gave farmers the confidence to begin investing and using fertilizer, investing in irrigation pumps, et cetera. So it was an interesting case where we saw some rather dramatic increases in yields. India doubled its wheat harvest in 7 years.
What 7 years are we talking about? Are these the Green Revolution?
1965 to 72.
Right, and then what happened?
And then they slowed down to a more normal rate of increase along with the rest of the world. But the introduction of the high-yielding wheats and rice has made a huge difference in India, and indeed throughout the world. I mean, the high-yielding wheats and rices are basically shortening the straw, the height of the wheat and the rice, so more of the photosynthate can go into seed. That's basically it. I mean, it's not anything magical about it. It's just shifting the amount of photosynthate, the pattern of photosynthate use by the plant.
Lester always sees this as a scientific problem. Rob?
Well, I think Lester's mentioning a very important example here. The Indian success was based not just on technological innovation, but powerful support from the government in the form of the Agricultural Prices Commission and the price guarantees that were provided. The government of India, when it was achieving this success, was spending about 22% of its public budget on agricultural development.
And what are we doing in the U.S.?
In Africa today, they're spending 5%.
And what do we do?
Well, 75% of the Farm Bill now is nutrition programs. I don't know if you want to count that or not. 80%.
You have a problem with that?
Oh, don't get me started on the Farm Bill.
We'll start talking about food stamps, then we'll be here all night.
Right.
So what are we spending, Rob? What percentage in the U.S. are we spending? Well, because crop prices have been high recently, the subsidies to support the income of farmers have been very low, less than $10 billion a year.
Do you believe in price supports and price bans for commodity crops?
I believe in the kinds of guarantees that Lester is talking about in order to kickstart a technology upgrade in countries where agricultural productivity is extremely low. I don't think farmers in the United States need subsidies, whether they're growing wheat or
How
corn.
about insurance? Do they need insurance?
We have private insurance markets for everybody else. I don't know why the government has to pay 62% of the premium for an insurance policy taken out by a farmer that has a net worth of several $1 million.
Marion?
When I taught a course on the Farm Bill, the students, and we were reading the section on crop insurance, they all said, we need to get into this business. We got to be in this business.
It's a good business.
It's really good business because the government pays most of it in, or a big chunk of it, and
And everybody is so bored by it,
I know.
and they don't even want to think about it. They don't realize that's where all the money is.
That's where all money.
That's where all the
And
money
there are only 16 companies that are involved in it. Oh, you want to get in one of those. There's money in that one.
Best to get out of it, Rob? We should, the U.S. government out of crop insurance?
Well, in Marion's utopian world, where everything is possible, of course we would do that.
I'm an academic. Why not?
Well, I'm an academic.
I'm an academic
He's
too.
at Wellesley, come on.
No,
That counts.
Yeah, it certainly does. I guess I'm not as eager to leap to an imagined ideal solution. I'd like to find baby steps that get us from where we are closer to that ideal.
I have one more topic I just want to discuss here because, what are you laughing at, Mary?
I can't wait to hear what it is.
I'm just a bundle of joy today, aren't I? You know, this whole thing about, I've been hearing in New York about local food, and that really the way to success are local food systems as opposed to these food from nowhere systems. And that if we know our farmer and if we can follow that local network, that somehow that's going to make for a better system. And it seems the United States military believes that too, because there's greater food security and greater complexity, it seems, as opposed to delivery systems which are much more monolithic. Robert, you've had some interesting things to say about local food. What is your take on that issue? Is that going to be yet another one of our utopian solutions?
Well, if you consider the part of the local food market in the United States that's direct sales from producer to consumer, so that's farmers markets and that's CSAs, and that's less than 1% of total food sales in the United States today.
So it's de minimis, it makes no difference.
Well, it's growing very rapidly, but from a small base. Our food system in the United States was very local 120 years ago.
It's all local.
Yeah, practically all local. We've been delocalizing for the last century because transport costs have fallen, transport technologies have improved, consumers have come to demand and to expect a wide variety of choices, both in season and out of season, both tropical products and temperate zone products. And local systems can do a very good job with some foods seasonally, but they can't provide that full service year-round supply, particularly in states in New England, like
Maybe
where I
that's
live in
telling us something.
Massachusetts.
Maybe that's telling us something about what we should or should not be eating.
Well, if you want fresh fruits and vegetables in the winter, which I hope Marion would endorse as a good eating choice.
All of this is much easier in California.
It is. It is. And as for resilience of local food systems, do a thought experiment. What if the Jersey Shore had been 100% dependent on local food when Superstorm Sandy hit? Then what? When I think about a local food system today, the only genuinely local food system I can think of is the one I described at the outset in rural Africa, where food doesn't move around because there isn't a road system. And so people are almost wholly dependent upon what's grown in a very local region. And when there's a drought, there's a famine.
Marion, you want to respond?
Yeah, I do. I mean, everybody talks about local food systems as if it were 100%. I don't think local food systems have to be 100%. But what if you had more local food? What if you raised the amount of farmers market, local, regional food that was being sold? It seems to me that that would have many benefits, but it doesn't have to be anywhere near 100%. You know, I like having fresh fruits and vegetables in winter, and I don't unfortunately live in California these days where they have those things. So if you live in a climate where you can't grow food year-round, although I must say even here, the business of hoop houses is extending the season enormously, I think more is better, but it doesn't have to be 100%.
Lester, did you have some final thoughts or a roundup? Because we're kind of heading towards the end of our panel. Do you have maybe almost in a curtailed fashion some conclusions, since you've been in this business longer than we have? You can say no.
No, I was just thinking about supermarkets. Going into a supermarket today, it's very difficult to tell what season of the year it is. And it's also interesting to watch people in supermarkets. People in supermarkets, you would think with, 600 options to choose from, and, everything is there. You think they'd be smiling and happy and so forth. People in supermarkets never laugh, and,
I love supermarkets.
Too many choices.
Too many choices. I think that's part of it. But one would think, with all these choices, we would just be bubbling over, just so happy. But we're not. We're not. And that's something to think about.
What does that mean?
I don't know. I've been observing this for years now. The answer is, I think it's part, one of the things that's nice about farmers markets is you can talk to the people who are producing the food, and it's that personal contact that I think is one of the keys to farmers markets. I mean, you usually get fresh produce as well.
And you think people are happier?
Yeah. I think the people who go to farmers markets enjoy it and find it a useful experience, because in a supermarket, you can't even tell where the food is from very often. I mean, there may be a label, where you can figure it out, but we've sort of achieved the goal of being able to buy almost any kind of food you want any day of the year. Just go to the local supermarket. And you would think we'd be a very happy people, going to the supermarket would be fun. But it's not. It's not the same as going to a farmer's market where there's a link between you and the farmer and the land.
Just that, do you think that there's, we're talking about 2050. Let's think about a best case scenario, Lester, in 2050. Is it possible that everyone on Earth will have access to a supermarket? Or is that a recipe for disaster, environmental disaster?
Well,
or just plain impossible?
Certainly the trend in the world is toward supermarkets. I mean, the development of supermarkets is one of the indicators of development. And so we seem to think that having a supermarket in New Delhi, for example, is progress. And in some ways it is, because people get food options they certainly would not have had before. What they often do not get, and what supermarkets do not offer, is the freshness that you get with farmers markets. I mean, we've
Yeah, but I think you asked a hungry person if they're too concerned about freshness. I know the answer.
Which is?
To give me the food.
Well, we've gotten to the point where we can transport food for long distances, and it doesn't perish. But we've had to breed tomatoes and apples and almost everything else to withstand these stresses. And then in doing that, we've lost the emphasis on flavor, for example. I mean, I can remember all the tomatoes I knew growing up in southern New Jersey, in tomato growing area, very tasty tomatoes. And then they began breeding varieties. Campbell Soup, when it came into New Jersey, and Camden, New Jersey, began breeding tomatoes that would make good tomato sauce or ketchup or what have you. Not that they would make a good tomato sandwich. And so we lost a lot of the flavor. And we began breeding for very specific things, and flavor was not necessarily one of them. Hardiness was, so that tomatoes could be picked mechanically. I mean, when I was growing up, the tomatoes we had, you could not pick them mechanically. You'd end up with ketchup, it just wouldn't work. So we've seen these shifts, and I think we've lost a lot in the contact with people on the land and the land itself. I'm not sure what the alternative is, but there are real social losses there, I think.
I guess then to follow that up with maybe a last question. What we're seeing here, particularly in America, Lester, is fewer and fewer people farming. And maybe that has to do with the efficiency of the farm, right, which maybe is a good thing, or maybe there's a downside. Is there a virtue in millions of smallholder farmers on Earth? Is that going to be the answer to global hunger? All these very small farmers doing a better job all across the face of the Earth? And is that going to give us a certain kind of morality that perhaps we're missing now when we have this kind of mass-produced food? Maybe we can end there.
Well, farmers markets are a response to the depersonalization of the food system, if you will. And we welcome those. I suspect all of us have been to farmers markets, which is a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, way back, there were farmers markets all the time, but we've been sort of rebuilding that. USDA is supporting this. It has a budget item, line item to support urban markets, urban fresh farm markets. So that's something that's, I think we've lost a lot. We're trying to gain some of it back now, and I think that's good. One of the things that I'm concerned with is what I've referred to in the past as the new geopolitics of food. And we see this most dramatically at the international level. We see land has become an investment commodity. And you know, Goldman Sachs is buying land, not because they ever planned to farm it, but they want to buy it and hold it because its land values over the last, 7 years have been going up about twice as fast as the Dow Jones Industrial Index. So people want to invest in land, and it's being recognized worldwide as an increasingly scarce resource because the demand for food is not slowing down, and we still have the 2 billion people projected to be added to world food population, to world population. So we're in, I think, a difficult situation, and we forget. Some of the investors thought if you bought 1 million acres here, you know, you could start farming it. And what they didn't realize that modern agriculture requires a highly developed support system. I mean, if you're a farmer in this country and a piece of equipment breaks down, you call the local farm equipment dealer, you know, in a few hours they got someone out there fixing it. If you're doing this in Africa, good luck. You know, I mean, the infrastructure doesn't exist. Or things like testing soils. Farmers here can get their soils tested. You know, the local county agent, you know, agricultural agent provides, you know, ways of doing this. So we have all sorts of services built into the system. Insurance is one of those, crop insurance. And we forget how much it takes of this infrastructure to support modern agriculture. You can't just create it in a vacuum. I mean, it won't survive. So these land grabs, the first seem like a great idea. And investment terms that make
The land grabs being international, and sometimes even other countries like Saudi Arabia leasing large tracts of Central Africa.
And China, very much worried about where the food's going to come from its 1.3 billion people as they move up the food chain. What was it, 5 million, or at least 5 million acres on the 50-year lease in the Ukraine, for example. But we're seeing the recognition in the world market that land is going to be a scarce resource. It is becoming a scarce resource.
I think we're running out of time, speaking of scarce resources. So I think that what's going to happen is that actually I think they set up a little table outside where if there are questions, we'll be sitting there and signing books if you want to purchase books. And because everybody here has
A book called Food Politics.
has a book called Food Politics. Exactly. But really, please join me in thanking this really illustrious and